name is Sam Sechler. I am originally from around here, and then I went to Auburn University down in Alabama, where I studied animal sciences and got my degree, and then continued on for my master's in animal nutrition. And after school, I moved to Nebraska, lived in a couple different places out there, moved back, worked for a feed company, moved back west, worked for a different feed company. And now I'm back here and just loving being back with my family, my friends and everything. So I'm excited to be here with you guys. I'm not sure if any of you had gotten to come out to any of the winter ones where I had spoke. I don't think so, but so today I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about grasses and forages, why they're important, and a little bit about like how to tell differences and make management decisions based on the time of year. So let me, okay. Oh no, my internet connection is unstable. This is unfortunate.
We can see your screen though.
So good. Perfect. Okay. So what do you think is important about forage? Like, why do you think it's important to your horse's diet? Anybody? Okay, so why is it important? First, it's the foundation of the equine diet. So that should be the basis of any horse's diet. It provides 50 to 90% of your total nutrient intake. So we talk a lot about grains and we put a lot of focus on which supplements and which grains we want to feed, but really your hay and your forage is what makes up the primary amount of your horse's diet. They need to consume 1.25 to 2% of their body weight in forage every day. So that can be from a number of different things, be it hay, beet pulp, grass, and a lack of good quality forage can lead to a variety of health and behavioral problems. So colic, founder, different stall vices, poor top line, weight loss, ulcers, and poor performance. Basically, if it's not getting enough forage, its gut's not going to function properly. So I know you guys have had a few nutrition talks. So you know the hay and the forage is all fermented in the cecum, and they don't really do well with a lot of grain. So it's really important that this forage is constantly going through their system. Otherwise, they're going to be uncomfortable. And so that's when you start to see ulcers, which, you know, if they're in pain and uncomfortable, they're going to act up and they're not going to thrive. So what are some of the factors affecting quality? So one is soil fertility. A lot of times we just think like, oh, it's dirt, it's fine. But really there's a lot of different types of soil. It's really important to know what quality soil you have if you're wanting to grow good quality grasses. You also have differences in crop species and variety. So can anyone name a type of grass or hay that we often feed horses?
Like alfalfa or a Timothy mix?
Absolutely. Yeah. So Timothy is a type of grass and alfalfa is a type of legume. So they're both forages, but they're a little different in how they grow and what they provide to our horses. But so grasses like Timothy, orchard grass, fescue, so that's going to be your species. And then variety is kind of, it's like a little subspecialty of the species. So you probably wouldn't ever hear someone refer to them directly, but if you were buying grass seed, you're going to see a type of fescue or a type of orchard grass, and usually they'll be named after like where they were developed. The maturity level of your forage. So is it just starting to grow? Is it old and been standing in the pasture for a long time? That really impacts like how nutritious your forage is, how it's harvested and stored, and then the environment. So this is a very generic picture, but it really goes to show you like how grass grows throughout the year. So we see that when grass is like short and little, It has really high quality but low yield. As it continues to grow and get taller, the quality decreases and the yield increases. So what that means for you is that basically the younger the grass, the more nutritious it's going to be, which is great if you have a horse that needs a lot of calories or is doing a lot of work. It's less advantageous when you have a horse that's a really easy keeper and one that just gets fat on air. Having that young lush grass can really be tricky. Additionally, when someone's going to cut forage for hay, that farmer wants to make as much hay as possible. So many times they want to get farther to the right of this graph, so higher yield. And when we're buying, we want to be farther to the left of this graph and be at higher quality. So where those two intersect is really an important part of making sure your hay is the right quality, but also, of course, it has to be advantageous for the farmer or they're not going to keep growing it for us. We also see this difference when we're looking at like first cutting versus second cutting, because first cutting is usually so we see the grass growing now. But first cutting might not come till June. So that means that hay's been growing for months. So it's going to be more mature. When you have second cutting, it's maybe only growing for another month and a half before they cut it again. So therefore it's going to be less mature. So it's going to be a higher quality and more nutritively dense than say a first cutting, even though it's all the same grass. So the different types of forage. Forage is any fiber-based feed. So hay, grass, beet pulp, hay cubes. And there's no one forage that's going to be best for every horse, because again, each horse is going to have different nutrient needs. So you can see this picture here is a typical grass. We have hay, hay cubes, and then a dried beet pulp. So choosing the right forage. So cool season grasses, which are what most of our grasses here are. So even though they grow in the summer for us, they're still considered cool season. If you go further south, you're going to get more warm season grasses, and those are ones that will grow when it's really hot. But our grasses have to survive the winter, even though they're not growing at that time. So cool season is what primarily ours are. So they're going to be high in non-structural carbohydrates. So that's going to be like your sugars. The ADF and NDF are different fiber parameters. So they're going to be higher in those fibers, and they're lower though in energy, protein, and calcium. So, if you're feeding one of these, it's going to be a little higher in sugar, but they're not having a ton of calories in each bite. They're not getting a great amount of protein in each bite. So these are going to be grasses like our orchard grass, our timothy, and our fescue. Now, our legumes are a little different. So they're not actually a grass. So this is going to be like alfalfa and clover. So what's different about these is that they can actually pull nitrogen out of the soil and make their own nitrogen and put it back into the soil. So they're going to be higher in protein, higher in energy, and higher in calcium, but lower in sugar. So one reason I really like to think and talk about legumes is because we have a tendency to think that alfalfa makes horses hot, but it's not actually the alfalfa itself. It's the fact that it's more calories. So like 1 pound of alfalfa versus 1 pound of grass is going to have a lot more calories, which has given it the reputation of being a really sugary feed. And typically it actually has less sugar than our grass hays do. So if you have a horse that is sensitive to sugar, legumes can be a good tool. However, they're also higher in energy, and a lot of those horses that are sensitive to sugar are also on the heavier side. So it's kind of a balancing game. Then beet pulp is one that we definitely supplement with. It's high in energy and fiber and low in sugar. So it's from the sugar beet plant. It's from the fibrous part after sugar extraction. So even though it's sugar beet pulp, it's very low in sugars because all the sugar has been taken off, and this is just what's left over. So who has their horse out on pasture? Do they get to spend much time outside? Yeah. So that's great. That's a really natural way for them to get good forage intake. Here's to remember when you're managing a pasture. Stock or overgraze them. Sacrifice paddock grazing. I'm going to go over each of these in depth a little bit, but kind of just big picture. You want to make sure you're resting your pasture. You want to soil test every 3 years and fertilize as needed. It's important to mow and drag your pasture and to make sure you're controlling weeds. So stocking rate. So this is going to be how many horses you have per area. So for full turnout and for your horse to get like the majority of its forage needs met on just grazing, you need about 2 acres per 1,000-pound horse. So most horses that are kind of in this area, you know, our pastures aren't giving them 2 acres per horse. So that means we're going to have to supplement what they're eating. We're going to have to give them additional forage and probably additional grain. If you're just using them as supplemental grazing, you're going to need about 1 acre per horse. Of course, if you have a pony that's smaller, like you're going to be able to fit more of them. If you have a really heavy horse or a draft horse, like they'll need more room to be able to get their full forage amount. And what this stocking rate is dependent on management practices, soil type. Sorry if you guys hear my dogs, they're a little wild. They are dependent on management practices, soil type, and environment. So what works in one pasture isn't exactly going to be the same thing that works in another. It's going to depend on a variety of different factors. Having a sacrifice paddock. So this can be referred to as dry lotting or a holding area. Some people, it's just like a dirt area where horses can go. Some people have limestone paddocks. You know, really you can use an arena if it's like not being used as kind of the sacrifice area. And it's basically where you're going to keep your horses when you don't have enough forage for them to be on, when the pasture is resting and when your pasture is too wet, because having horses on the pasture when it's wet is not ideal. Even though it's a very common thing for us, sometimes it's unavoidable, but having a sacrifice paddock helps it keep your pasture nice. Rotational grazing. So horses, if you've ever watched them eat, they're spot grazers. So they'll find a grass or an area they like and they'll eat it all the way down and leave other areas completely ungrazed. So rotational grazing makes it so they don't really have as much access to like choose whatever they want. So you can more evenly graze. It also allows for adequate rest. So you'll be in one area for a period of time, and then when you move to the next area, that first section can regrow. It also provides better manure management because, like we said, they're spot grazers, so they'll poop all in one spot and then move to their next area. And so there might be some areas of your pasture that have a large amount of manure, whereas other parts have none. You can also drag piles, you know, different types of drags are available that will help distribute those nutrients, reduces fly populations, it dries out your manure and redistributes your nutrients to all of your grass. And then using electric fencing is a great option for internal fencing. So I have one in my pasture, and basically this winter when our ground was super wet, I could keep the horses in one section of the pasture, and it became kind of my sacrifice paddock while protecting the rest of my grass. So there's so many different designs and like different setups, but these are just a couple examples. So you can divide your pasture into as many sections as you want. Having these different sections though lets you move the horses, and the idea is kind of that they'll totally graze one area and then move to the next. And like you can see where some of these like dotted lines are, like that would be a really great place to have, you know, like electric tape or something, because you can move that really easily instead of having to like build solid fence everywhere, because that can be very expensive. And, you know, sometimes like you'll need to change it on years when you have a lot of rain versus years when it's dry. You're going to have different forage needs in different areas. So mowing and raking your pastures. So you want to rake to kind of make sure that everything's distributed and even. And Also, though, you want to mow. And so a lot of times we don't think about mowing because the idea is the horses are eating all of the grass, but they don't always eat the grass evenly. So we want to mow to about 4 inches before the grass reaches maturity. So you don't want to see those seed heads in your grass if you want to have optimal nutrition. You want to keep grass in the vegetative state. So reaches the seed head, it's no longer in a vegetative state. It's like mature and it's not still growing. Mowing and raking also helps with weed control and your manure management and control. Soil testing. So testing your soils lets you determine which nutrients your soil's deficient is. So just like we want to make sure our horse's diet gives them everything they need, we need to make sure our soil gives the grass everything it needs. So if you're going to fertilize, it's best to split your fertilizer applications into a few different times of year. So that way it's distributed more evenly. Lime is needed if your pH is below 6. If you do have things like legumes, so clover and alfalfa, you're going to want your pH to be a little higher. And so a lot of people will use manure as their fertilizer source. However, make sure you have enough acres before you spread manure as fertilizer, because if you're really not at those higher levels of acreage, you're going to have more manure than you can really add to your pasture. And then you're going to see more issues with bugs and just like uneven grazing and uneven growing of your grass. So weed control. Good grazing management helps limit weed, because when they're just eating one section and then leaving a section and going to another, those sections that are fully eaten down leave themselves vulnerable to weeds coming in and taking over that area. So if you have them graze consistently, the grass can grow consistently. So again, we want to mow to a height of 4 inches, and we want to use equine safe herbicides in the fall to control perennial weeds. So this is a really good time in the fall. You want to spray your pasture. There's a number of different products available that are equine safe. Some say that you can spray with your horses in the pasture. I'd probably wait until it's dry and they can go back, but you just want to make sure it is a pasture safe one. And it's important to remember that a lot of them can't be used as much if you have a mixed pasture that has legumes and grasses, because a lot of those herbicides that kill weeds will kill the legumes. So you might have to spot apply some areas, or lean towards an all grass pasture. So overseeding. So this is when you're going to take an established pasture and you're going to put additional seed on top of it. So this is really good if you have like a bare spot, if you just want to get a better stand of grass growing. And the best time to do this is in early fall. This gives the seed time to get into the soil so it's ready to germinate in the spring. But you can also do it in the early spring. Typically, seeding rates are going to be between 12 and 15 pounds per acre of overseeding. Those are going to be higher, of course, if you're starting a brand new pasture. And ideally, you want to keep horses off pasture until grasses are well established. So with overseeding, you get a little bit of protection of the new grasses from those already existing grass. But especially a new pasture, if you put horses out when there's like little baby grass, that's just like little shoots. When they take a bite of that, they're going to pull the whole root system out. So ideally, you don't want them out there when it's in that really young state. So when you turn your horses out onto pasture, you want to introduce horses to like a new pasture, ideally when the grass is 6+ inches. And you want to remove them when the grass is 3 inches or less, because those bottom 3 inches make the grass more vulnerable to being completely ripped out. Additionally, a lot of the sugars in the plants are in those bottom 3 inches. So if you have a horse that is susceptible to sugar issues, you really don't want them out when the grass is really short. And if it's a new pasture, like I said, make sure the grass has had time to establish a good root system. Otherwise, you're just going to have to keep replanting. So spring turnout. So, right, like it looks kind of like spring today and maybe this weekend, not so much yesterday. Um, but ideally you're going to wait until your grass is 6 to 8 inches in height. This lets it, be well established, well growing before you put the stress of horses out on it. And when you start in the spring, if they haven't been on the grass at all winter, you want to start with 15 minutes. So then you can increase by 15 minutes a day until you're at 4 to 5 hours, then continuous grazing is all right. Another thing you can do is you can feed hay prior to turnout. So this is going to make it so your horse is full so they don't try and go gorge themselves on all that lush green grass. Because they've done studies where they've put hungry horses out and people will think, oh, they're only going out for an hour, they can't eat that much. But because that horse is hungry and they really like it, they just like keep eating it and consume a very large amount, even in that shorter amount of time. So making sure they're not hungry when they go out can, help slow them down and let them acclimate more appropriately. So laminitic horses and grazing. So the sugar increases throughout the day and decreases overnight. So if you have a laminitic horse, early morning grazing is preferred because you have those lower sugar levels in the morning. Again, you don't want to graze below that 3 inches because that's where a lot of that sugar are. Those sugars are stored in those bottom inches. And so as those sugars increase throughout the day and then get utilized overnight, if it's below 40 degrees, they're not really able to utilize those sugars overnight. So that's another reason why spring grasses are higher in sugar. So even though they're starting to grow and it's nice out, we still have a lot of cool nights. And so those sugars aren't being depleted overnight. So does anyone have any questions on pasture management? Okay, so then developing a feeding plan based on your forage. So forage has to be the foundation. It's the foundation of how a horse's gut is set up. So it has to be a foundation of their diet. Then you're going to use grain concentrates to kind of fill in those big energy or protein gaps. And then you can either use supplements or a properly balanced concentrate to provide those vitamins and minerals. So in our pastures, our hays aren't going to provide everything, especially if they're not fertilized. They're likely going to be lower in protein. Additionally, since it's all one area with just a few types of grass and the same type of soil, you will likely to be deficient in some vitamins and minerals just because there's not a large variance in grass type and soil type. So that's why it's important that even if your horse is on 99% forage, like it might need some fortification of its diet. So does my hay supply all the necessary nutrients? You could also say, does my grass supply all the necessary nutrients? Ideally, you can get your grass tested just like a hay test. So you take a sample, send it into a lab, and you can see what your hay or grass is deficient in. So you can see a number of these where that green line is where you're going to say like it has enough. These are low in copper and our soils are low in copper and zinc. So that's one reason we need to supplement those. But you can also see here, these are actual samples, like results from samples I took. So you can see like protein is all over. Our calories can be all over, and our vitamins and minerals really vary. So that's why it's important to know what you're feeding and ideally like actually get it tested, because just looking at your forage can give you an idea, but it can't give you the whole picture. So once you know your forage, you can know your grain concentrate. So look at your protein and amino acids. Look at your sugar level. Is it guaranteed? Is it the appropriate sugar level for your horse? Do you need fat? It's considered a cool source of calories. So it's going to provide more calories without kind of that sugar brain that some of them can get. Does it have fiber in it? That can be really important if your horse doesn't have access to fresh pasture or doesn't have a lot of, new hay. Like, can you get some of your fiber in your grain concentrate? It's usually in there in senior feeds and some different growing formulas. So knowing how much fiber is in there lets you balance it a little more appropriately. And then the mineral form. So chelated minerals are more readily available to the horse. So if you can get chelated minerals, I definitely recommend it. That's when they are attached to acid and the body can absorb them and use them more efficiently. So you might have heard someone say something like, horses were designed to eat grass. If I put out a mineral salt block, that's all he needs, right? Well, I would bet that all of you probably feed your horse more than just grass and a mineral block. But this is something that people think like, oh, it's grass, they'll be fine. But you're not going to meet those vitamins and mineral requirements for the average horse. And if we're not going to meet them for the average horse, we're definitely not going to meet them for a horse in work. So you can kind of see where just this grass is below those nutrient levels, below that like aqua blue level. So that's why you're going to supplement with something else. So again, you want your forage to be the main foundation and then use grains and vitamins and minerals to supplement the diet. And make sure you're always feeding it at least the minimum recommended rate. Otherwise, if you're just kind of guessing how much of something that's already been developed, you can kind of throw some of those vitamin and mineral balances out of whack. But you can see here, this is that same grass, but then they used a grain to kind of meet those nutrient needs. So you want to make sure you're matching the nutritive quality of your forage to your horse's needs. So if you have a hay that's high in protein, it's really digestible, it's high in calories, we have an eventing horse or a pony. Which one do you think needs high protein, high energy, high calories? Do you think this pony needs a lot of extra calories? Probably not. So you don't want to give them that really lush grass, that really high quality hay, that really growing hay. You want to make sure that it's being given to horses that need it, because otherwise, even though we say it's more nutritious, it can be too much for them, and then it causes issues going the other way. Just like I don't need to eat Michael Phelps' diet, this pony probably doesn't need the diet of this horse in work. So what you could do is you could use something like a ration balancer. So that's something that's just going to provide like vitamins and minerals to balance out that grass. So you could give that to the pony that's on grass because it's going to meet those needs without giving them a huge oomph. So now we have a protein or hay that's low in protein. It's not very digestible. It's pretty low calorie. Do you think that would be better for your trail horse or for like a cutting horse that's in work? So you're going to want to feed this to more of a trail horse or something that isn't being really heavily worked, right? So that's going to be more nutritious for them because it's not going to help contribute to them being overweight. So a horse that's eating this hay but is in work is going to need something to balance it. So it could be something that's high in fat, something more overall, something like a balancer again might be what you would need for that horse that's not in as much work. So again, you're going to want to make sure you know your forage and know your grass so you can decide what to feed with it. Okay, so I heard you guys are going to do some feed identifications. So what does anyone know a form of feed? Okay, so we have whole grains, pellets, sweet or texturized feeds, extruded, and then like brands and mash. So I think brands and mash are not quite as popular as they once were, but they can be really good for getting liquids into your horse. If you have a horse that has difficulty chewing, it's something that is just like really soaked in water. So whole grains are going to be things like corn, oats, beet pulp, barley, wheat, or different specialty grains. and it's going to be the actual grain. So like you'll see a corn kernel, you'll see a whole oat. And these are what's also used to make pellets, but it's like the raw ingredients. The pellets. So everything is ground up and you use steam and pressure to make it into a pellet. So that makes every bite identical, and you can include fiber in there, and the horse can't pick between them. So there's a lot of pros, you know, they last a while, they have increased digestion because it's once it gets wet and it starts falling apart, like the horse doesn't have to work as hard to digest it. Sweet and texturized feeds. So traditionally sweet feeds were like caked in molasses. However, some more of the textured feeds now are using oil is what they use to kind of help everything stick together. So they're not all as like hopped up on sugar as they used to be. They can be a really good fat source to give your horse extra calories. So they're always going to be like whole grains and usually some sort of pelleted or powdered vitamin mineral. So you can see here, like there's a lot of different types though. So the one on the left looks really molassesy. It's kind of your traditional sweet feed. The middle one might be more of like a local mill mix where they kind of take a bunch of whole grains and mix it together. And then the last one is more of a new textured feed where it has the oil, but it has pellets and extruded and like little bits of different pieces and parts. Extruded feed. So have you ever looked at your dog food? You know how it's usually like a shape and it's really like light compared to a pelleted horse feed? So extruded feeds are kind of like pellets, but different. So they're ground and mixed, but they use a lot more heat than pellets. That really increases their digestibility. So they can be digested more before the cecum, which really helps lower the rate of gastric upset in the cecum, lowers that starch overload. They're typically larger in size, which can like slow horses down when they're eating, which is always good. But they're also lightweight. So it's very important to make sure that you're measuring according to weight, not just volume, because like 1 pound of an extruded feed is going to take up a lot larger area than 1 pound of a pelleted feed. So in this picture on the left, you can kind of see they're a lot, like they just look different than pellets do. They're usually some sort of shape rather than just like that traditional pellet size.
Hey Sam,
Yeah.
what is a extruded feed that you know of that we might know?
Yeah. So
Think of what that would be.
like a lot of the fat supplements, so like Empower Boost, what is Buckeye's fat supplement? What is it called? Grow and Win has extruded feed in it. Buckeye does a lot of extrusion in their feeds to increase the digestibility. I'm trying to think. It really typically is more of like your fats supplements that are like being done a lot. And it's I don't want to say new, but it's newer and becoming more utilized in horse feed. But like all of your dog food and cat food, like it's all extruded.
Yeah.
So you can kind of think of it, it's like a really lightweight pellet, and it's kind of the standard in that form, and it's kind of making its way over. So grass and hay identification. So I know that looking at grass can all look the same. And really this takes a lot of practice. So me just showing these couples pictures, like you're not going to become a grass expert. It's hard to look at them and just know what it is. So if you can get out in your pasture and look at your different grasses or look in your hay, take pictures, compare them to what's online. That's really going to be your best bet of learning the differences. And being able to tell what you have in your pasture and maybe what you need to add to it. So orchard grass is kind of one of our staple grasses here. So when it's growing, it's like lush and green. And then when it seeds out, which is often the easiest way to tell plants, even though we want to keep them in that vegetative state, their seeded out form is usually a little easier to identify. So you see it kind of has this like fluffy seed head with kind of like webbed out compared to Timothy grass. So these ones are really easy to identify in hay. You'll see they look, I don't know, kind of like mini cattails, but they're going to be like this big seed head on the end of your grass stalk. They usually grow pretty tall. So that's a good, that seed head is a really easy way. So if you know there's Timothy in your hay, but you're seeing a ton of seed heads, you also know that it's been left to grow a little longer. So you're going to have a more fibrous hay with lower calories. So you'll need to balance that. If you have a horse that needs a lot of calories, you would need to feed more hay, but that would also be good for a horse that doesn't need as many calories. Additionally, Timothy does go to seed head a little sooner than some of our other grasses. So having some Timothy seed heads in your grass isn't necessarily bad. It just means that, you know, they have to make sure there's enough grass overall to put in that bale. So this is fescue, not Timothy. Sorry. So it also has like a more multifaceted seed head versus Timothy, but it's not quite as like fluffy as your orchard grass is. And then you have alfalfa. So we don't usually see pure alfalfa fields here out west. You definitely see them a lot. But you can see they're not as like tall and grass-like. You know, they're a plant rather than just that grass blade. And they have purple flowers. So they're very pretty. But again, if it's flowering, they've gone to seed and it's no longer in that vegetative state. Clover. So clover can get a bad rap because like anyone's horse ever been a little slobbery when coming off of clover and then they get it all over you, right? So no one likes that so much, but they do provide a lot of protein without a whole lot of sugar most of the time. However, there are some clovers that can grow mold on them. So if you have like a really wet clover stand, you wouldn't want your horse maybe in there until it dries out. But ideally, if you could mix in some clover or alfalfa in with your grass pasture, you're going to look more like this bottom left. You can see there's clover, there's grasses, there's both red and white clover. You're going to have a more like nutritively diverse pasture for your horses so they can get more of their nutrients that way. So comparing your hay, sometimes you can see this a little easier. So the orchard grass, you can see where those like, when they dry up, some of that fluff kind of comes together. You can see that there's like different pieces versus the Timothy where it's just like one big seed head. And the fescue has a lot of really like fine little pieces. So fescue, you will see more and more as you travel further south. If you're ever buying seed that's fescue, you want to make sure you're getting a like animal specific fescue. The fescues that are used in lawns and things can have a toxin in them and they can make your horse very sick. So they have developed varieties that don't have, it's called an endophyte, but you want to make sure you're asking that that seed is an endophyte free or it's one that's designed for animals. You can also see in this hay comparison, so you have just meadow hay. We don't have that as much here. Most people have like established hay fields, but you can see the difference in your Timothy and orchard. So like that Timothy grass is just like a lot larger than your orchard grass. And just, you can see here, like this has a Timothy seed head. You know, you might see this one maybe starting to go to the seed head. So you can compare how much leaf sheath there is compared to the amount of seed head to kind of get an idea. Is this a younger, nutritive vegetative grass, or is this a more fibrous, mature grass? So here's just a few more. So this one, you can see the difference between grasses and legumes. So see here how you can see this looks like a smashed leaf. So like we said, alfalfa isn't like a grass shoot. It has leaves. So those leaves are super nutritious, but you're going to notice that. Like they're not going to look the same as regular hay. Here you can kind of see brome is one we don't really have here. They have it more west. But orchard grass versus Timothy and alfalfa. So again, you see the leaves here. You see more of these like flat pieces. You see some of these Timothy seed heads. Like I said, you're almost always going to see Timothy seed heads if you have Timothy, just because of how quickly they go to seed. And then you have like an alfalfa grass mix. You can see these leaves here, but then there's also some pieces of grass. Those hays can be really desirable because they can be fed a little more broadly than just a straight alfalfa. And it's a way you can kind of boost your hay if you need it a little better, but you don't need a huge boost of nutrition. So we don't need to probably go over all of the different parts of hay testing and hay analysis or grass analysis unless you would like to, Ariel. I think you're muted.
Oh, just kidding. Probably not too much, because you guys need to just know how the identification and stuff like that. So this was good. I also have a question. So I guess Timothy and orchard grass probably look pretty similar, except for Timothy's broader. Is that what you said?
Yeah, and it gets to be a bit taller. Also, a lot of times you're going to see that seed head. It's just, it goes to seed so much sooner. So like, it's just very common, especially if it's in a mixed field, that you're going to have it go to seed first.
Yeah.
And I can try and come up with some more pictures and things. It's really, if you can go and like find different grasses in the pasture and then kind of like compare them. I know like that's usually the easiest way, just because like it gets you used to looking for them. I know like for me, like just looking at them on the screen, like I have to go and look at what it is in order to really see what you're looking for, because it does look different in different stages.
Maybe we'll have to do that at camp. We'll go out and like march through a field and look at.
Yes. And then you can see too, like you'll see like depending on the grazing management and stuff, like you'll have different like weeds pop up in areas where like the horses probably grazed it all the way down to the ground, and then like these weeds fill in.
Yeah. Yes. So you guys that are on here, does anyone know what kind of hay they have? You have in your barn, or if you feed multiples?
I know we definitely have Timothy. And I think like sometimes when we run out of hay, we also get like some orchard hay.
Yeah, those are definitely two of like the big ones in this area.
Yeah. Greg and Susie, do you guys know what you have hay wise? Timothy is pretty common.
Yeah, we have Timothy.
Okay. Yeah. We have Timothy and what I refer to as second cutting grass. I don't know what what that is exactly. But
sometimes, especially in those second and third cuttings, it can kind of go both ways. Like sometimes it's harder because like it's green and like fine and quickly growing. Sometimes easier if you have like a pure stand of something, but so many of the fields now like are not like 100% one thing, which is not a bad thing, but it just makes identification a little trickier when it's always mixed together.
Yeah, for sure. And if you guys get like, we get our hay from someone who that's what they do all the time, is produce like a lot of hay. So even when we say we want Timothy or first cutting, whatever, sometimes each time we get it, it's totally different just because it comes out of different fields.
Yeah.
The softer, more fibrous. So
absolutely. And especially if they have a lot of fields, they can only cut one at a time, or they can only cut so much at one time. So like first cutting, if it's brand new at the beginning of the season when they're cutting versus like a little later in their first cutting harvest, like you're going to have different maturities and things. So it's really dependent on your hay producer. And so it's really important to make sure you find someone who's good and like pays attention to what they're doing and stuff.
Yeah. Oh, and okay, so I have one more question. Now I'll let these guys actually some questions. So switching different types of hay. So how does that affect the horse, or what kinds of changes between different types or cuttings would we notice? Maybe our horse's stomachs get more upset, or
Yeah.
Like that.
So when you're switching between grass hays, like you're probably not going to notice a huge difference unless you switch from one that was like really, really high in fiber, like a just like a really stemmy first cutting to like a really, really soft third cutting hay. Like you'll notice something. But if it's like all pretty even like fiber wise and things, switching from one grass to another isn't going to make a huge difference. It might give them like a little bit of looser stool for a couple days. But when you switch from like a grass to a legume or from like a lower like fiber stemmy hay to a really rich hay, you do want to go slower. That cecum is going to repopulate with the appropriate microorganisms. Especially if you're switching from grass to legumes, they kind of need to like figure out what they're doing. But if you're switching from like a really nutritive hay to like an older stemmy hay, you don't really have to go slowly because like its slow digestive rate is going to do that for you. And the horse is probably not going to be as excited as if you go from like something fibrous to really exciting. They're going to kind of be like, okay, this is what we're eating. So they kind of make that slower change for you.
Cool. All right. Does anyone else have any questions? Burning questions? No.
And if when you guys are at camp or anything, if you guys ever want to get like a hay tested or something, and we could go over it if you want, or some sort of hay, you know, hay or pasture, and you can see kind of how that changes.
Yeah, for sure. And it'll be easier too when we can get in person and do some more like identification, because it's just easier to like feel it and see it. And I'm very interested to look up those extruded pellets, because I'm like trying to think of like any grain that I've come across that has that.
A lot of, the fat supplements really are the ones you see it the most in.
Maybe in Purina Altium, those little tiny.
Oh yeah, they might be. I'm not sure. I'd have to look. I know they have different. Yeah, like, the round ones probably are, because I think Amplify's Purina's fat supplement. It's extruded, and I think it is round. So I bet that's what that is kind of mixed in.
Yeah, it's just a more kind of like formed.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Like shape. Yeah. So, all right, awesome.
Well, thank you guys for listening.
Yeah, that was awesome. I think we definitely needed to do the feed ID, and the grass was a good part to kind of add into what we've talked about.
Absolutely.
I don't really talk about that too much.
Right.
Talk about grains and stuff, but
yeah.
Okay. Awesome.
Alrighty.
Well, if anyone has any questions, I'm going to stick on for a little bit until everyone is off. So if anyone has any questions about anything, not just our nutrition talk, but if you had a question about something else, I'll stay on. And thank you, Sam.
Absolutely. Awesome. Thank you.
We'll maybe wrangle you in for our camp to come out into the field with us, and
I'd love that.
March around and look at grass.
Perfect.
So, okay. Well, thank you. You guys are free to log off, and have a good evening.
Have a good night.
I actually just thought of this, and I feel like my grain that I give my horse, I think it might be extruded, because it's like super light, and it's like a kind of a it's not like a pellet shape, and I never really thought of it, but I think it is extruded. It's like Sentinel Performance, and we've always soaked it because he colics pretty easily, and we just think that we've just always done that to like help him digest, I guess.
I know what you're talking about, because I've had a horse. When you brought that up, I knew what you were talking about, your feed, because we've had a horse that switched over from here.
Yeah.
From that, and yeah, it's like a round.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very likely. I know the one that it's not as clear, but like is like the perfect example. Is there's one called Total Equine. It's literally looks like just a giant like Reese Puff cereal. But yeah, a lot of those round ones often are extruded, and they are good for colicky horses because they are already partially, that starch is already partially digested, so it's not like hitting the cecum all at the same time.
Okay. And like, does that, we like soak it just because that's kind of what he like came to us with, and then we just didn't think it'd be like worth changing it. And so like, does soaking it like help anything? Like, is it worth it to soak it, or is it good enough to just leave it?
If he can chew, okay, there's not necessarily a like not exactly a benefit to it. Like it wouldn't hurt it if he can chew fully. Like it would be fine for it to be in full.
Okay.
However, soaking it does, like if he eats it all and eats it well, like there's no negative to soaking either. It's just like additional water they're getting. It's just, more work for you. So if he can chew, it's not bad to like give him the feed. But if he has any issues with chewing, then soaking it is definitely
Okay.
good.
Okay. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Well, yeah, that's all I had. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.